bears heavy on my mind. Then I look at you.
How y'all doing? Hello, I'm Paul Fain. I'm a reporter covering connections between education and the workforce, and we are here to talk about rebuilding the American workforce. And I am fortunate to have three expert speakers to walk us through here. To my left, Lisa McIntyre Hite, Executive Vice President and COO of the Competency-Based Education Network, CBEN. Lisa's previous roles include working with Guild in learning innovation and at Laureate Education with a focus on competency-based education. Lisa has a Ph.D. with a focus in competency-based learning, is a common theme here, and like me, is a fellow Ohioan. To her left, Mike Felton, Executive Director of the Grace Innovation Center at the St. George's Schools in Maine, where he was superintendent for a decade, focused on building community business partnerships and expanding access to CTE. I believe you're also the Executive Director, correct me if I'm wrong, of the St. George Community Development Corp.
That is true.
And that you hold a JD.
That is also true. You did your research.
Yes, I did. And to his left, Nick Moore, last but not least, Deputy Assistant Secretary, Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, known here in Washington as OCTAE at the U.S. Department of Education. I believe you have a dual role. Did I hear that backstage?
I do. I guess other than Secretary Rubio, I've got the most jobs in town.
We'll get to that a little later. So Nick is the longtime, we all came across Nick during his time leading Alabama's governor's office of education and workforce transformation, where he also was an education policy advisor. He has worked briefly here in the U.S. Senate before and was a teacher in Alabama before that. And he is both a Harvard and a community college grad, Enterprise State Community College in Alabama. So I want to start with Mike. You're working the most closely with our young people here. Can you give us a sense, what's the student interest in CTE? What are the jobs that folks are most interested in these days? Where do you see change?
So I'll start with sort of what drove us to do this. So our vision, what we're working to do, is to create the nation's first pre-K through 12 career and technical education program. And so that is now emerging. With our Yass Prize Award, we were able to build a 5,000 square foot building. There's a couple of shop spaces for boat building, woodworking, and metalwork, a traditional classroom, as well as a makerspace with 3D printers, laser cutters, CNC routers, robotics, and sewing machines. So we've got kindergarten students that are measuring 2x4s and cutting them with saws. We had a bunch of first graders build benches that are now going to be around the community. We've got third graders that are 3D printing. We've got eighth graders that are creating and model boats that they designed. The reason that we did this, I always say there's a twofold reason, and it's trauma and technology. Our students are coming to us with greater and greater needs. In our county, one out of every 10 babies born is drug affected. 25% of our children in our region have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So foster care system, substance abuse in the home, and so on. So their brains were affected by that and their development, and they were also affected by technology. So you've got second graders with cell phones, you see iPads and strollers. Their brains are so hyper stimulated from that technology that it's very difficult for them to engage. So to answer the question, what we found is when we allowed them to build and create with their hands and their minds, they lit up, they re-engaged. And we were doing this in part because many businesses were coming to us and say, Mike, we are struggling to find workers. You've got to do a better job having students go into these different fields in the trades and the technology. And that's what we've started to see. And what we started to see. And I mean, I'll say, like, in terms of opportunity, some of the best houses in our community are owned by the plumbers. And if you talk about what AI is doing to entry-level professional work jobs, I think the opportunities in the trades and the technology and hands-on, minds-on learning is going to be huge. And if we don't provide our kids that opportunity, we're actually doing them a disservice.
Great stuff. You know, I think there's a growing awareness that we have to start early with career exploration, and you're starting real early with first graders doing construction work, you know, really showing them how to, what's possible.
We need the workers.
Yep, indeed. So I want to turn to Nick next. Nick, the OCTAE office is moving over to labor. In DC, we call them IAAs, but there's a bunch of news around these interagency agreements where various pieces are moving around. Can you just give us the short version of the why and the how there?
Sure. Well, and I think just to directly answer with the why is the folks in this room and, the work that you just described, being able to put together a P20 CTE program. ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, Carl D. Perkins Act, and the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, those were aligned by design by Congress, but unfortunately the structure of our federal agencies that administrate those programs serves as an inertia on levels of state innovation. And so the work that we did in Alabama under Governor Ivey of integrating state agencies that administer workforce and education programs, that's happened in almost half the states, but where that innovation has not occurred is at the federal level. So what we didn't want to do is just navel gaze and sit around for 4 years and write white papers about it. We wanted to provide proofs of concept. So we're not formally transferring those programs, we're co-administering the programs with the Department of Labor, and we're trying to put together at the federal level easy ways. If you want to submit a combined Perkins plan, for example, and I'm kind of getting into the weeds, but for those of you that work in CTE and workforce, you've got to submit a state plan. Well, since 2018, you've been able to submit a combined plan. Less than 10 states have taken us up on that because you would get conflicting feedback from DOL and ED. The timelines weren't synchronized. So that's just one example of how our partnership with DOL beginning in this year, and you'll see next month, what we call a training employment's guidance letter or a program memo that will go out through DOL aligning the state plan submission timeline so that you'll be able to submit a Perkins WIOA plan, get integrated feedback on that. And beyond that, as each of these laws from 1965 to the present have been erected, states have also set up a duplicative level of state agencies to administer those. So as I like to say, there's just too much system in the money. A lot of, if you think about WIOA, about 40% of those dollars right off the top get eaten up by administration. So we want to see more of those dollars flow down to you, and we want to help you get to Yass. So one thing that federal agencies have not historically been good at, besides making websites, is being able to give a straight answer. So if you want a waiver, if you want a flexibility, we want you to say, what are you trying to do? If it's a formal waiver you need, or if it's just the authority to do it, we want to affirmatively say, let's work together to help you get there.
Good stuff. Thanks, Nick. I think you undersold a bit what you all achieved in Alabama under Governor Ivey with the Alabama Talent Triad. Definitely, I would say one of the most innovative merging of workforce and education. Lisa, CBEN has been part of that process, been a close ally of that work. Can you give us a sense of your participation, your excitement about what's possible with that sort of talent marketplace?
So the Competency-Based Education Network worked with Nick Moore to really help create that ecosystem that he just mentioned. And so at CBEN, we believe that competencies should really tell us more than what a credential or a degree does. A degree or a piece of paper doesn't really tell us what someone knows and can do. And a lot of times these systems are really siloed, right? So we have industry saying we need critical thinkers. We have industry saying we need, insert the name of the competency. And we don't necessarily have learning providers at the table really listening and then adjusting their programs to meet that need. And so we had the privilege of working at the intersection of industry councils in the state of Alabama. We worked across, I think, 13 of them that came together to really clearly articulate the kinds of competencies and skills they needed to be able to fill in-demand jobs. We were able to bring together learning providers that had credentials of value, which means essentially it could lead to meaningful wage gain and align to where the jobs are. And in the state of Alabama, every person gets a digital wallet or a learning and employment record. And so today, I think in Alabama, don't quote me on today, but the latest statistic I saw was that there are 125,000 Alabamians with a digital learning and employment record. that quantify over 2 million skills that those people have that actually align to the jobs that the Industry Council has, has identified. They've created skills-based job descriptions, and leveraging the technology and leveraging AI, we're able to create an ontology that connects the people with the skills with the in-demand jobs. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because you have people come to the table, come together, and have the important conversations about what that needs to look like. And so CBEN's role was really to be kind of that trusted third-party convener that really is representing the learner who needs to operate at the center of a work-learn ecosystem. Nick, did I get that right? Close.
You absolutely
Okay.
did. And I'll just tell you briefly, stay tuned next week, because what she just described, that what we're able to do in Alabama through the Department of Ed, we're going to put out a national challenge with some funding behind that. So I can't say much more than what I'll share at NGA next week, but I did want to flag that for you because I know the folks in this room might be very interested in that, the ability to get some federal funding to support developing your own talent marketplace, and what Lisa shared about having not only a credential registry so that we make credentials the wrapper of a bundle of competencies, a learning and employment record, so that we can revitalize mobility in this country, so that people have a geographic, social, and economic mobility, can overcome benefits cliffs. And then finally, this untying this Gordian knot of, in education, we speak one language and pedagogically describe competencies one way, industry does that in another way. So we can use AI and machine learning to interoperate, articulate those systems, so that registrars and people in the community college or high school don't have to get a new student information system or applicant tracking system. So very excited about that, and hope you will lean into that work and help build out a talent marketplace in your own states.
Okay, just to add something to that, made me think of this. So several years ago, when we were working on raising funds to construct the new building, we were talking with a federal agency that does economic development, and we talked about how the new building would help students pre-K to 12, and they said, well, how much are adults going to use it? So we went through and we calculated that, with evening courses, weekends, summers, probably 60% of the time adults would be in it, but that they were still hesitant. And I eventually got on a call with them, and they said, if even one student pre-K to 12 uses that building, we can't fund it because we fund economic development, not education. And I said, that there is the problem.
Thanks for that. And just to underscore, Nick, Alabama, I think it's safe to say, and I'm an independent journalist, so I can say this is ahead of the curve in the infrastructure that you were part of. But other states have been working on this too, and is part of what we're going to hear next week. I'll be watching, encouraging that sort of talent marketplace innovation in other states.
Absolutely, because political boundaries and commuting, people's commuting patterns don't stop at arbitrary political boundaries. You take this area, for example. On one metro ride, you can be in 3 subnational jurisdictions. So if DC or Virginia or Maryland has a talent marketplace, but it's not interoperable with the other areas, that'd be like if we had a different width lane in every state going down 95. It just wouldn't work. So we don't want to prescribe federally exactly what each state's instance is going to look like, but just in the same way that there was a important but benign federal role in electrifying the nation, public-private partnerships to expand broadband access. We feel like data mobility is a critical national infrastructure issue. And so what we want to do is to, the Secretary of Education supplemental grant priorities put out the first federal definition of a talent marketplace and described it as those 3 constituent parts of an LER, skills-based job description generator, and a credential registry. So with that in mind, we want to infuse some dollars and also make it clear that these need to be population-level solutions so that you've got enough on the supply and the demand side of employers, institutions, and individuals using it, because we do want to see there be signals that shift behavior. If we do this and we don't reimagine program design and the work that you're doing of showing that academic and technical skills aren't mutually exclusive, they're integrated. If we want to see, we've talked a lot about skills-based hiring, and there's been 40 plus governors that have signed EOs on skills-based hiring. But if we're honest, the rhetoric really hasn't matched the reality because the infrastructure hasn't been there to translate, what somebody's learning assertions, formal or informal, into those discrete competency statements recognized by employers. So this is going to be another tool in the toolkit. It's not going to be the panacea. There's a lot of other policy levers that we're going to have to couple, like doubling down on work-based learning and registered apprenticeship. But we think it's a critical element in the federal role for fostering data mobility.
Thanks for that. Mike, I had a question for you, and take it where you'd like. But, at the Grace Center, you work on business partnerships. I'm assuming, you're hearing about the needs of employers from employers themselves. How do those signals get to you? What would you like more of there?
How do the signals come to me from the businesses?
Yeah.
They'll stop by my office.
Right.
And so, there's plenty of research and data in Maine. So we're an aging state. We're one of the older states in the country, if not the oldest, and our county is the oldest in Maine. So we're probably the oldest county in the entire country. And when I talk to employers, I say, so we've got like I talked about rising needs. So our incoming pre-K class, every year, 50% of them already come in with IEPs requiring services. Of those, every year you've got probably 2 to 3 in a class of 20 to 25 that need a one-on-one aid because they're not safe to be on by themselves. Now, we've invested heavily in early intervention, and we've seen that change. And we're also investing in this and focused on this hands-on, minds-on learning. But what I say to employers, if we already have a shrinking population of graduates, and 25 to 50% of them are struggling to function, then we are not going to have the numbers to survive as a state economically or as communities. So the investment that we're making in early childhood education and changing our approach to education, that is going to produce the workers that you need, because we know we're going to have a shortage no matter what. So we need every single one of our graduates to be ready to achieve. And the other thing that, you made me think about, Nick, was I am constantly in events where people say to me, well, CTE is great, but you got to keep the rigor. Or CTE is important, but you can't forget about academics. And I'm always like, listen, we give these kids a challenge. You have to get from point A to point B, and we're not going to tell you how to get there. You've got to figure it out. And and you're going to have to use your English skills and your math skills and your science skills and your art skills to get there. And guess what? That's real life. And the world they're moving into is going to be more like that than it ever was for us. Because if something is formulaic, it could be repetitive, it's going to be automated. So the jobs they're going to have, they have to be able to create something new. They have to be able to make connections. They have to think thoughts that were not thought before. And that's the kind of education we're trying to give our students. Everyone is going to have to be an entrepreneur and hustle. That is the reality.
That's right. Can I want to build off something that Mike shared here. So when we think about these young learners and this false narrative that we have to choose between career technical education and a more academic philosophical pursuit, it's a false dichotomy. We need a both and we can't keep having the either or rhetoric. And so when we talk about what a competency is, we say it's the knowledge, the skill, the dispositional behavior that you need to have to be able to apply all of those things. So knowledge, skill, ability, disposition, how you apply it. It's not just about the technical skills. So an example I like to give is we all have to interact with nurses. We need a nurse that has the skill of being able to draw blood. No one wants a nurse poking at your veins 10 different times and can't get it. That's not fun. But we also need a nurse who can come in and say, hey, Mike, did you remember to skip breakfast today? How you doing? Good, good. You seem a little nervous. Let me tell you how this is going to work. I'm going to tie this band around you. You're going to hold on to this ball, and it's going to be over before you know it. That's the nurse we want, not the nurse that's like name, date of birth. Did you eat today? Okay, thanks. And so it's not just about teaching a career technical skill. It is also about the disposition, and that is the uniquely human aspect that we have to lean into. We have to be able to teach people how to make connections, how to relate to one another. And to say that that just automatically happens in an education program, we can't just say that anymore. We have to be transparent. We have to help learners understand that they're developing those competencies in real ways. And I love to hear that y'all are doing that in your school.
Steve Ladd is the CEO and president of Steel Pro, which is an advanced manufacturing steel fabrication company in Rockland, Maine, right next to us. And they ship all over the world, products manufactured, made to India and other countries and across the nation. He said to me many times, like, Mike, I can teach somebody to weld. Like, I can teach that. But I need someone who can be a team player, think on their own, innovate, figure things out. Those are the students I need you to send me. So I think, you're absolutely right. Like, we've got to create the conditions and really build that into how we teach, because with the impact of technology and with the challenges our families are facing, our kids need those opportunities to develop those skills.
And we can't predict the jobs of the future. Sorry, Paul. I'm just going to
this is
keep
the way it
going
should
for a
be.
second.
Please.
We can't predict the jobs of the future. I just was laughing with a friend because about 10 years ago, they're like, I want to be a social media influencer. And I'm like, that's not a job. Lo and behold, in Ohio, I saw Progressive Insurance, job posting, social media influencer. Almost every major corporation in America has a job titled social media director, influencer, fill in the blank. 10 years ago, I'm sitting on a tape being like, that's not real. You can't do that. There's a real paying job to be a real estate agent in the metaverse. I don't know what that means, just to be very clear. But I don't need to know the technical skill. I need to know that I'm creating resilient people who can thrive in an unknown future. And the way we can do that is by being more transparent about the competencies they're developing. Yeah.
So, thinking about how we help students be nimble in a rapidly changing, unknowable labor market looking forward, there's some change coming out of Washington. The opening up of federal Pell grants to shorter term programs, 8 to 15 weeks, will become eligible next July. It's a workforce Pell grant. Some details to be hashed out. Nick, we could talk for hours about this, but can you just give folks what to be watching for as that becomes a reality?
Absolutely. It's a long time coming. I know, been talking about short-term or workforce Pell since I was on the Hill 10 years ago, and it finally came to fruition. And there's a few things we've got to make sure that we're keeping in mind here. One is that you want to have high quality. You want to have the guardrails to make sure that, we're not selling wooden nickels to folks and you end up exhausting your lifetime Pell eligibility and don't have much to show for it. But we also want to make sure that it's not more difficult to get an 8-week program approved than it is for somebody to get a Ph.D. approved through their state higher education office. So we're going to be doing a negotiated rulemaking beginning next week called the AHEAD Committee. If you want to watch that, you can tape your eyelids open. Some of those neg regs can get quite boring. There is moments of epiphany that happen in the process, but they're important because we want to hear from stakeholders about how to strike that right balance. It's also important to keep in mind that governors and state workforce boards are going to have a role in that in defining high skill, high wage, or in-demand occupations and sectors. And those are keyed on to the definitions in WIOA and Perkins, which leaves it up to states to make those definitions. So it's going to be critical for governors and state boards to get even more involved in that process than they are, for example, in coming up with the list of programs that are eligible for Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act individual training accounts, because we call that the eligible training provider list. And if you've seen one state's ETPL, you've seen one. Some of them are great. Some of them have got a Christmas tree with every program that some person brought to them. So I think it's going to be a key lever of economic development for states. The governors and the workforce board have really developed a process, and I'm going to flag what Lisa mentioned of what we did in Alabama of setting up sectoral partnerships, and we called this the ACCC, the Alabama Committee on Credentialing and Career Pathways. Probably would have renamed it because people hear that and CCC, is that the Alabama Chinese Communist Party? No, it's all private sector business people have been appointed to it. And so the governor, and we use the National Career Cluster Framework through Advanced CTE because that is a great way of having a way to differentiate between the academic and the more industry way of describing skills. And so we use not just raw labor market data, and the sort of secondary LMI providers are great, but you want to get in there with your own data and figure out sector by sector, region by region, what are the jobs that are in demand. But that's not going far enough. Then you've got to come up with what we call the DNA of those jobs. And so we had a tiered model, 4 tiers, And the bottom were academic, personal effectiveness skills, what a lot of people call soft skills. I never really liked that term. Life skills, the things that you would need to be able to do to be successful throughout the course of your life. The second tier were industry specific. So each of those 14 industry sectors was 16. Now they've revised it, it's down to 14. So what do you need? And you get as many employers to agree industry-wide the skills that you would need for an industry, entry-level job. Then tier 3 is essentially the ONET work process schedule for a particular job. And what ties it all together, and why I like the work that CBEN is doing so much, is because you tag the credentials that have a underlying competency that denotes mastery of one or more of the skills in the first 3 tiers. So the idea is that eventually we'll have a currency in the labor market of competencies and not credentials. So we're moving, and part of this shift from reducing degree and credential, and the sort of inflation that has accrued over time is not to just eliminate degree requirements, is to make sure that they're in the right place. And the best way to do that is first identify the job and the competencies. Then you can tag the credential to it and then understand what is the right role of a credential, say, in the hiring and evaluation process. It also opens up reimagining program design. So it's very hard to have more than just course-to-course articulation agreements or assertion for credit for prior learning if you can't quickly reduce course outcomes, syllabi to those competencies, and then get under the hood of the credential and figure out what the value there is. So a lot of those vignettes and those streams of work are going to inform implementation of Workforce Pell, not just through what we put out through the final rule, but how that's going to look in each state. And so the states that are really leading on non-degree credential quality and transparency, that are building out these data systems, they're going to be able to do that work at scale and not just manually having to do the matching. We worked through a lot of Excel spreadsheets, and that got pretty wonky very fast. So that's the exciting leading work that I think has been going on for the decade prior to the adoption of Workforce Pell, that's going to allow many states that lean into it to not just let somebody earn a short-term program, but to make sure they're also stackable and portable. And it also proves out the point that you could start in a short-term program and still end up with a Ph.D. The idea is that it's more like an interstate highway. You figure out what exit ramp you want to get off of, and if you reach the end of another, it's generally going to turn into another interstate. So there's mobility within the same vertical and within one firm, but also portability to be able to say, okay, well, if I've got skills in healthcare, there's also jobs in medical coding you could get into, or insurance. So that's all part of helping people own their own learning over a lifetime, and not to be gatekept by an institution or just the fact that it's hard for them to formalize their learning.
Great stuff. I think you did a great job there of showing how kind of structural this shift is, with skills as the currency, the center of this. And it feels like, from listening to you, that Workforce Pell, beyond being a grant that could make a difference in industry-aligned professions, to help moving that shift a bit. And Mike, I want to come to you in a second on short-term credentials, but when I hear skills as currency, I think of competency-based education. You talked about stackability. In certain career paths where we have a desperate need for folks in these jobs, certified nursing assistants is probably the best example. Wages aren't great, despite us needing those folks. And as we just reported today, somewhere between 3 and 13% of CNAs ever make it to full nurse status, despite, those are supposed to be stackable pathways. Looking forward, how can what Nick's describing there help make that real? Stackability a real thing?
Yeah, I'm going to keep pulling on the nursing thread. So what we know from our work with the American Association of Colleges of Nursing is that healthcare employers are telling us that only 9% of nurses are practice ready when they get on the job, and 36% of nurses leave within the first year. And if I had to hypothesize why that might be, it's because our institutions, our colleges that are preparing nurses, are incentivized to do one thing: get those people to pass an NCLEX exam. That NCLEX exam does not emulate what it takes to be a nurse in the field and on the job. And shame on us for churning out nurses. And when I say us, I'm a former dean, so I'm a higher ed person who loves higher ed. Shame on us, though, for churning out graduates, taking their money and making it so they are not prepared to be successful and then want to get the heck out of there after a year of being on the job. And so when I think about these stackable pathways from certified nursing assistant, medical assistant, on paper, it's a great idea because we don't want to create pathways to poverty, right? It's not important. Just to be clear, if anyone wants to be a medical assistant in CNA and that is their passion and they can stay there and have a sustainable life, that is fantastic. But for the vast majority, it is not a living wage. And when we say there are stackable pathways, the reality is today there aren't. If you are a CNA and you spent 5 years being a CNA or a medical assistant, when you go to nursing school, you have to start over. And our most valuable commodity as human beings, regardless of where we are in our lives, is our time. And we don't have a way to actually acknowledge the skills and the abilities that a CNA or an MA has, ingest that from a systems perspective in higher ed, and actually say, hey, guess what? Anatomy and physiology, you got that one. Compassionate care and dispositions, I'm going to come watch you and I'm going to verify that skill. You're done with that one. Now let's work on the 70 other competencies that I need you to spend time getting so you can be a practice-ready nurse on day one. And I do think that with making these credentials stackable, because it's not an either-or proposition, it's like take this little bite size, take that off-ramp, go be a medical assistant, come back to us, but we're not going to make you start over. We're going to acknowledge the skills and competencies you have and build the system that way. And there are some states that are doing that work. So in Arkansas, we worked with the American Association of Colleges of Nursing to map what are the skills and competencies from CNA, MA, LVN to RN to BSN. We need that kind of granularity to be able to create seamless on and off ramps for people. If not, it's just lip service to a stackable pathway that still leads to poverty. And I think that's really the promise and potential of some of the guidance coming from Workforce Pell.
Well, it's great to hear that work's happening. We profiled a CNA today who's 26 years on the job, 3 kids, never had a chance to move on, and won't get credit for what she's done serving patients. That just seems wrong. Especially considering how desperate we are for nurses. Mike, I'm really glad you led with Maine's aging population, the urgency there to better connect folks with careers. Your state is really ahead of the curve on short-term credentials. I like to call them on-ramps to professions, the Harold Alfond Center, the Maine system. And one of the things I think is so cool about it is the Maine Community College System center focused on short-term industry-aligned credentials. The chancellor of the system told me they've got more than half the state's employers signed on to a compact, in some cases where they help pay, where they help subsidize that training, or they contribute instructors or equipment. And he describes it as pre-hire training. Really kind of flipping the paradigm for an employer. You used to be able to hire a welder. Now you're going to have to help train the welder. Are you seeing that in the state? Are you seeing a change among both employers and really students looking to get that on-ramp to occur quickly?
Yeah, I do. Where I probably see it the most is among parents. Like parents, they recognize the challenges their children are going to face if they don't have the skills. Like they're hearing all the reports about the hard job market right now if you're a recent graduate. So they're very aware, and they're pushing on us and on employers to align things and to coordinate together. And it makes me think about a couple things. One is, because our community is so small, and Maine in generally small, I always say you can't have our kids go off to be in a silo, separated from the community and not involved in it from when they're 4 years old to when they're 18. Like they have the capacity to learn skills, to do things, to contribute throughout that. And when we talk about the new building that we've constructed, so we do pre-K through 12 CTE, we also do adult education and workforce training. We also have a paramedicine and telehealth program, because our goal is to create a healthy, highly educated, or highly innovative workforce. And I also think about the amount of people who learn boat building working with their grandfathers, or working with their parents, or working with their father. And and the amount of skills that were passed from generation to generation. And that happens when kids were relatively young, whether it be elementary school, middle school, high school, just growing up part of the community and the culture. And what we're really trying to do in the new building is bring those generations back together. So when our first graders are building benches, they're doing it with the local contractor. When our students are working on an underwater ROV, they're going to go visit Knox Machine Company, which is, this is a great story. They're a small company, and in the 70s, the guy who started it, he started making pot haulers for lobster boats, which are this mechanism that helps pull the lobster trap out of the water. They developed as a machining company, and they have now contracts with the DoD and SpaceX. So I think what I also see in this time, coming from like a rural America perspective, is there is this opportunity, if we do this right, where rural America can lead innovation and economic development in this nation. And one thing that I think I was talking earlier about with a few different people is, in our community, which is a traditional like fishing working class community, our parents are like, we want this for our kids. We want them doing this hands-on work. We value the trades and these skills. And I know in some more affluent communities that are more focused on the college-only path, they're really hesitant about this. They're like, well, what about my kindergartner's seat time? Like, we don't want the kindergartner sitting down that much in class. So I think there's a really unique opportunity here for rural America to thrive again and sort of rebound from the losses we suffered in the 90s and the early 2000s with a lot of the loss of manufacturing.
Great stuff. I think apprenticeship can be the best of all worlds here in terms of education, academics, and real hands-on work experience while you're getting paid. I don't know anyone who doesn't like the idea of apprenticeship. It's still tiny in this country, however. It's just not how we're structured. Nick, are we going to see growth? Are you optimistic? Are you hopeful for apprenticeships moment finally arriving here?
It's a big priority of the president. It's one that Secretary McMahon shares, and I think it's one that we can make appreciable progress on. That we've got a goal of having 1 million active apprentices by the end of the administration. We're going to really need to get to about 1.4 million due to those that are exiting to reach that goal. And part of where we've got to think about this system is recognizing that this is the oldest form of learning that, and I'd say this somewhat cheekily, but, Jesus Christ, Abraham Lincoln, and George Washington were all apprentices, right? And so and across all cultures and from the beginning of time in this country, apprenticeship has been a hallmark of the way that we learn. But since 1937, a 2-page law called the Fitzgerald Act has resulted in thousands of pages of regulations, Part 29 and Part 30 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And that has created an inertia on new and expanding industries participating. And right now, registered apprenticeship is largely dominated by construction and the skilled trades. And that's great. It's a model that works well for them. But what we've got to do is expand registered apprenticeship into areas like, and I think this is where we could get at some of the actual reciprocity and working with occupational licensing boards so that you can, in fact, move from a CNA to an LPN to an RN and do that without losing your time having to repeat processes. And so due to the sort of federalized nature of, in Alabama, there were 500 different occupational licensing boards. Well, what we did is said, look, if you earn a registered apprenticeship in this field and there's also an occupational license, this apprenticeship credential, there's reciprocity there, so you don't have to go back and re-earn some other credential. And on top of that, if there's no rate of decay, if we're just licensing somebody to pay a fee or to be a cartel to gatekeep people out of the industry, you got to remit that fee back to the state to go into training. And so we've also got to think about integrating registered apprenticeship, not just into K-12, but as a spectrum of work-based learning. And it does begin at the earliest years with career exploration. We were glad in 2018 to see that you can use Perkins dollars as low as 5th grade for career exploration. But as you mentioned, it can begin earlier. We had a program in Alabama called WeCats in my hometown of Enterprise where you had preschoolers that were doing things like putting the toothbrush and dental floss and things on an assembly line for dental offices in town, and learning about employability skills and things like time management staying on task. And again, it's not that we're trying to go back into the world of tracking people or differentiating based on ability, but it's this notion that, again, academic and technical skills are integrated. So you've got to have this spectrum of work-based learning that begins in career exploration and that culminates in registered apprenticeship. And it's a two-generation issue to where we see a lot of folks self-track into occupations that don't lead into self-sufficiency because you don't know what you want to be if you haven't seen what there is to be. And so you've got to have robust career exploration, particularly, as you mentioned, in rural areas, to where there are employers, there are people that want to invest in young people, but often the school counselor or the career coach has got 500 kids on their roster, and they don't have the time to make those authentic relationship with employers. So that's where the public workforce system can really come in, and that's another part of what we're going to do through our partnership with the Department of Labor. There's no reason that the Career Center and the community college and the guidance counselor at the high school all have to be siloed off from each other. And there's certainly no reason why, I'd like to say we've got about 43 loaves of bread and this little jar of mayonnaise spread all over it. So when you got 43 workforce programs across 9 federal agencies, it's hard to really invest in registered apprenticeships. So we're going to get more formula dollars out to states so that governors have a reason to make registered apprenticeship a big priority. We've had a flexibility waiver that came out of DOL last week that emphasizes the fact that governors can set new goals for how many people come through the Career Center that are co-enrolled in registered apprenticeship. Because if you do look at the results, the economic results of registered apprenticeship, they're really strong. It's just that it's in too few occupations, too few industries. And until we add more value for the employer, there's not as much of an incentive to get into it if you're in a different industry than has historically valued it. So the last thing I'll say on is that we've got to prioritize intermediaries, and there's some great groups that help take the onus off the employer for registration to make occupational apprenticeability determinations, and that's something that we're going to focus on. It's working with governors and state boards to set up processes to take that burden off of the employer, and while we're at it, eliminate a lot of the sort of safetyism that goes around a lot of the red tape that gets put up for apprenticeships. And then also, as I mentioned, of getting to direct answers for us to be able to demonstrate through child labor laws that you can have in-school youth registered apprenticeship. It's not going to cause your liability insurance to go up. It's not the end of the world if you got a 16-year-old that's able to work in an occupation that, as long as they're not doing underwater welding or something extremely hazardous. So within the bounds of what's safe, you can in fact have those in-school youth apprenticeships.
I know Indiana is a state to watch on youth apprenticeship. Very ambitious goals. I think 50,000 youth apprenticeships the next years or so. Nick, speaking of goals, just to put in context, the administration goal is 1 million active apprentices. Last I checked, we're at about 689,000, 700,000. But so some ground to make, but I think a lot of interest in doing that. Lisa, can you talk a little bit about the National Project on Apprenticeship Standards and Interoperability, or as we said, how the feds help states get on the same page with apprenticeship?
So CBEN is leading the project on apprenticeship standards and interoperability, which I'm not going to say again, so I'm going to call it PAISI, P-A-S-I. What that project is really working in partnership with the Department of Labor and the Alabama Commission on Higher Education to work across states to have interoperable apprenticeships. Because right now, if you, for example, are an apprentice in Florida working on electric and solar, that might not have reciprocity for you to go work in Texas, where they also need people who can work on solar energy. They have different sets of standards. And so part of that work is to both have interoperable apprenticeship standards, but also high quality standards, so that there is good faith that we know that if you were an apprentice here, it actually can translate over to being an apprentice elsewhere. Not only are we focused on that happening in skilled trades, but also in fields like education and teaching. So how do we take paraprofessionals and actually get them involved in a registered apprenticeship where they can become certified licensed teachers? How do we do that in nursing, where we can take that, make that stackable pathway? And so part of that is we don't want a disjointed 50 different ways of becoming a nurse apprentice or becoming a teacher apprentice. It's not quite tenable, but we also want to be able to empower the states to have voice in that. And so the project on apprenticeship standards and interoperability, oh, I said it, PAISI, is really focused on bringing folks together, particularly state apprenticeship directors and industry leaders, to align on what those standards can be and make sure that they're portable, but also expanding it beyond the trades. I had a good fortune of going to Oxford, and I know we always have comparisons in apprenticeship to other countries, but you can apprentice to become a doctor, a medical doctor. You can apprentice to be a nurse practitioner, and so it still is in partnership with education providers and things like that. But in other places, they are doing this because we are not going to meet the needs of a teaching shortage or a nursing shortage doing things the same way we have. And so part of this project is really focused on growing those apprenticeships.
Thanks for that. We were talking backstage, Mike, about the potential for the shipbuilding industry. If you all watch baseball or sports, you saw the buildsubmarines.com ads behind the home plate there. That's the Blue Forge Alliance, which is really interesting public-private partnership to drive workforce development, to really bring that industry back. First of all, I'm curious if you're seeing that in Maine, which has a big history there, but also just your optimism about those sort of creative public-private partnerships to get employers back at the table with educators.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have more than optimism. I see it as a necessity, and I think we often don't change until we have to, and now we're at that have to moment. There's huge opportunity in Maine. I was at a boat, Back Cove Yachts, boat construction facility in our region, and I asked him, how many people could you hire right now? He's like 20 or 30. That's how short they are with those skills. Now we've got kids who they go to this nonprofit called the Apprentice Shop, and they're learning these boat building skills. So that that's a wooden boat building program. Just yesterday I was having a conversation with another nonprofit, Herring Gut, and our CT coordinator, basically like our shop teacher and our makerspace director, about having the kids build these underwater ROVs and then study robotics. We'll connect that with Knox Machine that I talked about. We want to reach out to Bath Iron Works, which is the big naval shipbuilding facility in Maine, and bring them in. I mean, this is the biggest lesson I've learned in public education in 20 years and 25 years, and I guess 10 years of being a superintendent, is we cannot do this alone. If we try to do it alone, we are guaranteed to fail. We've got 40 business sponsors, and they're not only contributing resources, more importantly, they are working with our kids and our teachers to shape the curriculum for our 3-year-olds all the way through. And then it gets them involved into the school, and it links the whole community together. So it's not an option. It really is the only way we are going to get this done. And I remember visiting Bath Iron Works, and really good businesses are going to think about this. And on the wall in one of their training recruiting centers was a flow chart. And the flow chart, it had college and community college and high school. It went all the way back down to kindergarten. Because that's how they're thinking of recruiting, because they have a huge shortage. They need the workers. If they don't get them, they're not gonna win government contracts, and that would devastate our state economy. So I think the businesses are open to do this, and they've been excited about it. And I think on the education side, we've got to, and this is what I love about the people in this room and the people who were in my cohort, especially in 2023, these are people who are doing whatever it takes to meet the needs of kids, and they will work with whoever's heart and skills are in the right place. And we always say we got to break down silos, but I was just talking about this. That is not easy. It is hard. We, by nature as human beings, we don't like complexity, but human life is complex. It is getting more complex. So when we can find ways like this, that we're a synergy to pull people together, that's where the real transformation is going to happen. And just like we don't know what the jobs of the future are going to be, we honestly don't know what the schools of the future are going to be. We're creating them right now. So
that's a fantastic note to end on. I want to thank all three of you for doing a great job bringing the complexity to bear here. Cheers. Thank you all.